In general, I think people would admit that are familiar with the situation that Russians are somewhat less rule following than Americans. But I give an example from history. During the American Civil War, so we're talking in the 1860s, there were reparations made, actually even during the war, to people whose property was damaged by the marshaling of armies in the north and elsewhere, all around the country, I think. And there was a case in Pennsylvania where somebody sued successfully, saying their barn was damaged or some such. And this seemed totally incredible to the Russian mind, to the Russians thinking of the complete anarchy of Russia during the period much later, during the revolutions of 1918. And I believe it's still, when you think not in terms of law or justice, but you just think in terms of rules, you can see Americans tend to accept rules much more readily. They internalize that than do people in other parts of the world, especially than in Russia. I just add that as to show this, again, to bring out this problem of the where we are in history if we allow that the principle that Hegel raised of equality under the law represents the final peak, and then you can judge from that peak how far people are from realizing it based on their as it were, their mental their mindset, let's say. So I wanted to go again over the Kojeve principle a little more rigorously. It's so the way I shrink it. Kocheve's phrase is the free and homogeneous society. He said America has achieved this. And so, in other words, the society that is homogeneous and that everyone is a citizen under the law, and the law is blind. But I want to say, Kojeve wouldn't say that something like the Dreyfus affair is strictly speaking impossible, but rather that it would just be like sporadic crime, regular crime, rather than organized crime. As organized crime is something which amounts to an extra legal order within the state, whereas sporadic crime is like an accident from the point of view of the principle, from the point of view of, let's say, the spirit of the people in Hegel's sense. It could happen, but it's just an accident, and it would have no future on the whole. So let me try to raise the modern issues into the problem of justice. So that in the one sense, the principle of equality comes into trouble because of the empiricism that we just mentioned, the empirical problem and the Steven Pinker way of deriving human nature. But there's another sense where it comes into difficulties, which reminds of the current issues of view regard. As you say, that the current issues aren't due. We use the word racism in the citizens' understanding very broadly, but if you make a technical definition and you understand racism as being part of an explicit doctrine whereby somebody could get along just fine with people of the other race, but then they read the doctrine and then they find out that even though they like these people personally, they must object to them on the basis of what they've learned from the doctrine. But there's another sense, and that is that we have this notion of the unconscious biases, which are playing out in a way that's like Carlyle's notion of the manipulation. They guide us, but we don't quite know what's happening. So I think of in regard to, do we truly know what we mean by equality. So this is a question which can go in two directions. One direction is the Wittgenstein direction. So Wittgenstein says, if I say something and I don't fully know what I say, have I thereby spoken nonsense? So there's a kind of a bounded rationality problem in a radical sense, that do we truly know what we mean by equality? Because as soon as we start digging into the details, we say equality under the law, but what does that actually mean? It actually turns out you can split it by the ancient sense between justice and the good. So Hayek spoke all the time against social justice, So it's not that Hayek was really at all of the same mind as modern libertarians or the modern right. It was rather that his idea is that acts of justice must be acts. So act means that I have some understanding of what I'm doing, I do something, and then I can be held culpable for it. So I understand that I have some property and I don't want to rent it to a minority because I think it will lower my externalities. It will create negative externalities, and all my property will be worth less. So I deliberately discriminate, or I discriminate simply because I hate some people and I don't want to live near them. In any case, this is an action. But the question of the good it's convenient to think of it in American terms. The question of the good would have to be separated, and this would have to go to the historical people that are the historical disadvantage issue. So we had a case not that long ago in the Supreme Court in America where Justice Roberts came out and spoke of the de facto discrimination. So the de facto discrimination isn't a matter of justice by the sense that Hayek meant, and that's why Hayek had a problem with the notion of social justice, because it's not a matter of acts that people are deliberately doing right now. It's a matter of the past, and which should then, on his view, be go to the Congress, and the Congress can, if it wishes, pass laws or assign monies, as it were, to make whole people who have been disadvantaged because of things that the state did in the past. So, for instance, the reparations to the Japanese Americans after the many years because of the internment camps. So it's this separation. So the Congress would have to deal with the principles of the good overall, whereas the judiciary branch cannot touch the de facto disadvantages, according to that way of breaking it up. But then this is further complicated by the issue of how should we decide what is good, because the good has to be measured by what's possible. What is the equal? So where's the equality? Is the equality only under the law in the American sense, where the law has to do with the judiciary branch, and then it's under the concept of justice, where justice has to do with acts, with what people actually do with some understanding of what they're doing, so that there's a mentality involved, there's a choice involved. There's also the question of competency, whether they were competent to make a choice, and whether they can be under the law in that sense. Is the equality under the law in that sense, or does the law go all the way to the question of the good, to where the equality then has a much broader meaning? And it's also, of course, then you can see that equality begins to take on all sorts of meanings, which was, so for instance, Leo Strauss says in Antiquity, the Athenians, with their experimentation in governance, struck on the notion that there could be a law that says that the attractive young men must have sex with an ugly woman before they have sex with the good-looking woman that's actually appealing to them, in order to equal things out, and other things of which would amaze us if they were proposed as legal standards today. But you can see how the whole subject, which falls under the question of reason, will lead us to not quite know what equality means. Maybe like Wittgenstein says, we speak of equality, but we don't actually know what we mean, and does that mean therefore that we talk nonsense? On the other hand, there's this question of the if you think of this notion that the law is not fair because it favors people who have money, and you think of the old classic example of people sleeping under bridges or under the awnings of movie theaters, let's say, and urinating in public, or begging, laws against begging, and then you say the Anatole France examples, you say these laws are applied equally to the rich and the poor, but it's obvious that the rich aren't going to fall, don't have a great need to beg in public unless it's for supplements from the government maybe, but not on the street. Aggressive panhandling isn't something you're likely to be charged with if you have billions of dollars. So then it becomes a question of priorities, and then it becomes also a question of whether at all the law is simply a fraud perpetrated against the poor by the rich. And the whole question of the equality under the mere law becomes very difficult. And this is all, this interpretation of this issue of equality and law is a mirror or interpretation of the idea of reason overall. But what region is this idea happening in? We have to go further into that.